All right, I'd like to welcome everybody to the Chicago Archaeological Society. Thank you all for coming here today. For those that are new to our group has been around for something like 100 years, from what I've heard from members of lore, going back to the 1920s. People that are interested in archaeology got together in Chicago and started talking about it. Over the years, the group has evolved. In the 1940s, we had one of the first female archaeologists, part of the group, Harriet Smith. She did some great work over at Cahokia. In the 1960s, at least by then, the name the Chicago Archaeological Society was being used, and the mission to understand all of mankind was established. Later on, in the late 60s, we joined the IAAA, the Illinois Association for the Advancement of Archaeology. So we're one chapter of many chapters throughout the state of Illinois dedicated to the understanding of local archaeology. So in addition to understanding all mankind, we also want to have a better understanding of archaeology as it applies to Illinois, bringing together enthusiasts, amateurs. Or the lights just keep changing?
It is a little bit.
Okay. The lights are possessed here. Okay, it is our Halloween meeting. But anyways, so if you're not in the Chicago area and want to attend more meetings like this, they're going on throughout the state. Check the website out for the Illinois Association for the Advancement of Archaeology. And as a member of the Chicago Archaeological Society, you're also a member of the Illinois Association for the Advancement of Archaeology. From them, you will get occasional publications throughout the year, wonderful magazines. And then from us, you get a monthly newsletter. What is it, 9 times a year? The Codex, which we talk about our meetings, past and present, and events that are going on that are of interest. So hope you all join today. If you're not already members, or if you are members, I want you to stay members. So check us out at chicagoarchaeologicalsociety.com. There you can go and check out your membership, renew your membership online. We still take checks if you want to renew your membership that way, but if you want to do it online, you can do it at chicagoarchaeologicalsociety.com. All right, so that's our general business. But today we have Dr. Erin Waxenbaum from Northwestern University, and she is going to speak about forensics anthropology. Please welcome Dr. Waxenbaum.
Thank you. Ooh, I'm so short. Thank you all for inviting me to speak with you today. I'm really excited to speak to this wonderful organization. So I decided to speak today about the interface between forensics and archaeology. We often have this perception when we think about the different hats, the different fields of anthropology, they're often portrayed as being very distinct. They're often put into these little sort of maps and schemes where they're separate entities. Our lights are possessed today. But in reality, we all know, anyone that engages with any of the subfields of anthropology knows that there is a lot of interconnectivity between our 4 subfields. None of them can exist without the play of the others. So to introduce, for those that might not be familiar to what forensic anthropology is about, we're primarily taking theory and method from biological and forensic methods and applying them to matters of legal concern. Many biological anthropology methods that are employed in a forensic context are also used to study human evolutionary remains or historical archaeological remains. Very little about what is done in forensic anthropology, though there is some, but very little is novel or outside the confines of traditional academic biological anthropology. But taking it into the arena of legal concern, usually forensic anthropologists are posed with a few questions. Identity, in terms of who the individual may be if they can't be identified some other way. Timing of when they died or what may have happened to them after death. And then, if possible, any information that may have contributed to their death that can be discerned from the skeleton specifically. There are a lot of ways that someone could die that would have no impact on their skeleton at all. So there's many scenarios in which a forensic anthropologist could be asked for a trauma analysis and not find any evidence of trauma. That doesn't mean that the individual didn't experience anything traumatic, but no evidence was left on their skeletal remains. So despite what TV shows like Bones and others portray about forensic anthropology, forensic anthropologists are merely one sort of cog in the wheel of the broader sort of forensic scheme. For anybody that dies in a particular jurisdiction, the medical examiner or coroner in that locale is responsible for their remains and what investigation goes into their remains. And anthropologists are just one of many other specialists or consultants that medical examiner or coroner may solicit advice or information from to put together an entire picture. So the types of cases that forensic anthropologists analyze really are broad and run the gauntlet, and once again are at the discretion of the medical examiner or coroner in that particular area. Predominantly, anthropologists are brought in because the remains are not inherently recognizable. So they may be in some state of decomposition. They may be fully skeletonized. In some instances, they're burned, dismembered, or in some cases, it's not as frequent, but it does happen that anthropologists are called in to look at cases that are relatively recent, that are fully fleshed. Over the years, and I would say more prominently in the last 20 to 30 years, anthropologists have become more of a prominent figure in both domestic and international cases involving things like human rights violations. We're seeing right now in Ukraine the discovery of mass graves. They want documentation both of identity for those individuals, if possible, though often very difficult, but also documentation of evidence for amalgamation of cases for war crime tribunals and things like that, looking at patterns of trauma, patterns of behavior in the decedents that could be useful in the broader scheme. Cremation analyses, we often have this sort of stereotypical view of cremated remains as being just pure white dust. In most cases, cremains include a lot of large identifiable fragments of bone that can be used to confirm that they are in fact human. There have been a number of unfortunate crematorium cases over the decades that funeral homes or crematoriums have not returned family members appropriately to their families, and significant debris or even non-human remains were included in those assemblages. So sometimes families want to confirm that the remains that are being returned to them are truly of their loved one as much as can be determined. And last but not least, mass fatalities. Plane, train, automobile accidents, especially on the larger scale, have become unfortunately more prominent in recent decades, most notable being 9/11. Anthropologists were the central repository for information that was coming from family, that was coming from other experts, pathologists, dentists, etc., and putting all that information together to try to confirm identity, and are still doing that at the New York City office of the chief medical examiner. So the main objective of most forensic anthropological analysis that we're going to talk about today are usually fourfold. It really, once again, is at the discretion of the forensic pathologist, medical examiner, or coroner involved in that particular case. They decide what questions they have that they'd like expert suggestion on. First, what I'll talk about today is location and recovery of remains. That would not be possible without archaeological method and technique. Time since death estimation. This is going to be helpful in determining forensic significance of the remains that are found. Not all individuals that are human that may be discovered in an archaeological context might be deemed forensic. And I can talk about a case like that toward the end. Identification, I mentioned, is a really prominent aspect of what anthropologists are usually asked about in a forensic context. So we'll talk about the construction of a biological profile. And then lastly, evidence of trauma. So in terms of location and recovery of remains, as I mentioned, that's really just the most obvious, I think, highlight of the intersection of forensics and archaeology, that in the absence of archaeological method and technique, it would be difficult, if not, completely impossible to recover decedents for subsequent analysis. Many anthropologists have a background in archaeology or specifically trained in archaeological field methods. Really depends on the area and jurisdiction. I should have introduced myself better at the get-go, I realized. But not only do I work at Northwestern, but I'm also the forensic anthropologist for Cook County. And I can list them off, but many other counties throughout Illinois, but Cook County is my primary secondary employer, if that makes sense. Northwestern is probably my primary employer, but Cook County is a very close second. And I'm also a research associate at the Field Museum. So for Cook County, just given the quantity of deaths that occur in urban environments, I'm very rarely, if ever, but I'm not gonna say never, but very rarely called to scenes when remains are discovered. Usually they're recovered by investigators and associated personnel. In some of the more rural areas of Illinois outside of Cook County, I'm much more frequently called in during recoveries because just the concentration of deaths is not as high. There's not as much of a need to get the remains moved. There are many scenarios, once again, I'm alluding to a story I'll tell toward the end, but other facilities around Illinois that can help with recovery of remains when needed. NCIS at the Naval Station has been a really helpful service. They have a lot of great field recovery equipment, as well as some resources in my own department. Time since death or post-mortem skeletal information is going to be important in trying to help determine how long that individual has been deceased in that particular locale. In this case, we're looking at both components of decomposition of the soft tissue, as well as diagenesis, change that's occurred to the skeletal material after the soft tissue has fully decomposed. And there's a number of different tools that we use in schemata like this to help put a relative time clock on how long it's been since the individual was from the individual's death to discovery based on the environment in which they're discovered. Temperature is really a prominent factor in determining how decomposition is going to occur. And after that, there's a lot of changes that occur to the skeletal material itself as a product of its environmental surround. So things like seeing vegetative material growing through holes or orifices in the bone, soil staining is pretty prominent in remains that are discovered on the surface or below surface. Root etching, shown in the picture on the lower right, it's just a demonstration of how long the skeletal material has been in contact with that surrounding environment. Obviously, things like mummification, the drying out of soft tissue, or saponification are other soft tissue skeletal sort of intersections that are a direct response to the environment. So having an understanding of both how the material was discovered as well as the environmental surround can provide important clues as to time since death. When we think about construction of a biological profile, conveniently, I think, forensic anthropologists have very basic fundamental tools. Basically, they're varieties of on a ruler that are going to help give us estimates and measures of different parts of the body. Lots of different calibers pictured here in osteometric boards. There's also inclusion of microscopic analysis, histological analysis, looking at the substructure of the cells of bone, or even DNA analysis, which is pretty infrequently done by most forensic anthropologists, but it is a potential tool in a forensic anthropologist's arsenal. What we're looking at primarily in terms of collecting data to construct a biological profile, we're looking at visual traits, what we call macromorphoscopic traits, things that we can visually appreciate about the skeleton. Looking at on somewhat ordinal scales like this, on a scale from 1 to 5, to look at the degree of expression of different traits. And we're also going to take osteometric data, taking physical measurements with the tools mentioned before of the body to use in different array of formula and computer programs that can help make different estimations of biological profile components. Everything's pop up. So an important first part of is that stuff blocking the screen there? I try to move that too.
Nope, you're good.
Is that better?
The people on Zoom can't see it.
Oh.
Only we can see it.
I can see, I'm looking good here. I see a screen. I see number 3, biological profile analysis.
You're down there. It's not blocking the-
It just does not want to go away. Let's see.
You can hang down there.
Sorry.
No.
Okay, there you go.
Perfect. Thank you. So it sounds, I think, silly sometimes, but an important first part of a biological profile analysis or any anthropological analysis is to confirm that the remains are human. As the wonderful forest preserves we have throughout Illinois attract a lot of visitors, and they also attract a lot of individuals that are really excited to find naturally decomposing non-human animals and think that they've stepped upon a murder of some, exciting, dramatic. I don't know what they're, I don't know what they're looking to find, but many people report, and I think when in doubt, it's good to call the police and confirm things are on the up and up. So I don't want to scoff too much at forest preserve visitors, but oftentimes people find remains that are non-human. So it's important to be able to justify in my reports to medical examiners, coroners, and law enforcement that the remains are in fact human. Now I can't advance my slides. There we go. Most forensic anthropologists are trained not only extensively in human anatomy, but have a strong zooarchaeological background in non-human animal species, so as to be able to substantiate and justify which remains are human and which remains are not. In many cases, the way in which we can very quickly ascribe an understanding of a species being human versus being non-human are a lot of traits that are very obvious to us. The way that we use our body dictates what our body looks like. Primarily being bipedal, walking on 2 legs, influences a lot of the shape and size of our body parts. Obviously, even compared to some of our close relatives up there on the right, we don't have particularly oversized canines. We have a much larger brain case than we see in other close relatives. So usually, on whole, it's pretty easy to assess or ascribe a species as being human, especially when looking at the skulls. Good Halloween time, right? So everyone wants to see pictures of skulls. But when we look at, humans versus gorilla up here, it's very obvious what traits specifically appear human. But fortunately / unfortunately, I'm going to throw that out a lot. Most forensic anthropologists don't receive complete single individuals. Oftentimes remains are fragmentary. And so having an appreciation of human as well as non-human anatomy can help us make the distinction in cases like this. We're looking at the lower end of the upper arm here, just above our elbow, with the human example on the left and 2 non-human examples on the right. And in all honesty, to an untrained eye, especially law enforcement or investigators that are out in the field, it's very difficult to appreciate the difference. I think I have some more examples here. I think human tibia on the left in each image, and we got bear on that left image. We've got sheep on the right, pretty sure. This one's looking at a human arm and tibia versus dog. We have size differences, but oftentimes people will ascribe those size differences to it being a subadult, a child, as opposed to an adult, which adds an additional layer of drama and intrigue on top of the remains they found in the woods. And oftentimes it's just, and particularly in Illinois, a deer that presumably naturally died, naturally decomposed. Not that crimes against non-human animals can't be adjudicated by a court of law, but that's not the purview of a medical examiner or coroner. They're primarily focused on human remains. Oh, I don't know, I threw all the examples in here. Human clavicle on the left there versus a turkey humerus, which, I couldn't fault too many people for confusing those. I mean, exactly same size. Lengthwise, those pictures are not blown up. Turkey humerus, human clavicle, they're in a very similar ballpark. Here's a great sort of stereotypical forensic anthropology comparison. The image on the left was a real case, not mine, but others. Excuse me. And you can see, it looks rather suspicious. The remains were found with a significant amount of soft tissue still on them. And so this is an X-ray next to an example of a human hand. And to the initial viewer, it seemed very suspicious, and we would not want to see a human hand with those fingers cut in that dramatic fashion. And I always like to ask any sort of guesses. This is a better educated audience, but any sort of guesses of what that non-human animal hand is that looks very comparable in size and a bit morphology as well to the human example? There's no bad guesses. That's the perfect guess, right? Because they would be comparable in size to humans, but no. But alas. What'd you say? Ooh, that's an interesting one. I've not gotten that one before. They usually have significantly longer hand bones than humans, but good guess. I often then like sort of leak that the remains were found, I believe, in Washington State. That helps me. It's a bear. So it was a bear paw that presumably in the layout of the story got caught in a bear trap, which is common and legal in certain areas. And that's what caused the remains to be in the state they were, which, like I said, I mean, there can be crimes against non-human animals that are illegal, but that's not the purview of most medical examiners and coroners. So, and you can see, I mean, let's step away from the microphone for a second, but if you get, if you look around these metacarpals here, you can sort of see the rounded shape there, the kind of V shape in the non-human animal example. So if you look close, you can see that, but a individual that does forensic anthropology is usually more trained specifically in human, but like I said, non-human anatomy as well, to be able to justify why a case like this does not require further investigation in this particular purview. So sex estimation, and in academic circles, a lot of things are not necessarily discussed in the way that they would be in the public domain. And we very strongly distinguish between terms like sex and gender in a forensic anthropological scenario. Sex, biological sex, is dictated at the moment of conception. It's based primarily on our chromosomes. Usually, most humans have 2 sex chromosomes, either 2 X's or 1 X and 1 Y. But gender is more of a social construction. It's culturally determined across a spectrum of what is deemed feminine and what is deemed masculine. And this varies not only across the United States, but across the world. We, kind of have this, cultural paradigm of there are 2 genders, but we are seeing more and more evidence of that not necessarily being the case. That was well appreciated across the world in many other areas, that either putting a number to a broader array of genders or even not putting a number to them. So anthropologists, forensic anthropologists, are not going to speak to gender as that's not something can be appreciated from one's remains, one's physical remains. But what can be appreciated is features of one's biological sex. So usually, now it's, I'll read it to you. So usually a forensic anthropologist report will have some sort of explanation, because once again, our audience is law enforcement and medical doctors or coroners that are elected officials. So you want to ensure that the information that we're providing is appreciated in the way that's intended. So part of my sort of disclaimer in a report would be, anthropological analysis assesses biological sex only, which may or may not be consistent with an individual's self-identified gender during life. Ideally, when we're looking for identification, we don't want investigators or police to exclude somebody as a potential missing person that might match the identity of an anthropological report because of this sex and gender divide. So there may be everything else lining up, but sex and gender are distinct from the anthropologist report versus what the missing persons report says. And we want to ensure that that's not a detriment to an individual being identified. So how are we going to do this? As I mentioned before, part of the tools are visual assessment, metric assessment, taking measurements of the body. Any sort of guess as to where we would look to assess sex expectedly in the body? Yeah, right. Pelvis, number 1. Fantastic. Anybody have a second guess? Yes. Oh my goodness. What a lovely audience. So a postcranium, everything below the head for sure. And last but not least, we look at features of the cranium. In recent past, I'll say it was expected that the postcranium, the long bones, as was mentioned, and skull would be switched. But honestly, there's much stronger, greater accuracy with sex assessment of the postcranial skeleton than the skull. And this is sort of predicated upon what those X and Y chromosomes do for individuals. In particular, that Y chromosome increases the concentration of testosterone in individuals over their lifetime. Both males and females have stereotypically male and female hormones, but the concentrations differ both early on in development and later on in puberty. And so that greater concentration of testosterone later on in the pubescent period naturally leads to greater muscle mass in biological males versus biological females, which leads to greater anchoring of those muscles on the skeleton. But first and foremost is that pelvis, because another big discriminator between biological males and biological females is the potential to give birth. And so a lot of the features that we see that help estimate sex are variations in the pelvis that relate to childbearing. Whether we like it or not, most things about the female pelvis are relatively wide compared to the male pelvis. That just facilitate that wider birth canal. Humans don't have the easiest birth process compared to, well, the animal kingdom broadly, but primates specifically. For most other primates, birth is nothing, requires no social support or help. But for humans, we have a bit of a tougher time because of all of those pesky modifications to accommodate bipedalism has really put some pressure on the pelvis to vary. But there are some unique features that look a little bit different in the images above. Not sure where I can move that to make it helpful, but really we're just looking at with images on the left here being more female, the images on the right being more consistent with a biological male. And they're not screaming exaggerated features, but there are nuanced features that we're going to look at holistically. We're not going to see one feature and immediately ascribe or estimate a sex. We're going to look at a whole collection of features in an ideal world in the pelvis, throughout the long bones, as well as the skull, to put together a complete picture of what that individual might look like. For long bones, once again, greater muscle mass in males and also about an 8 to 10% body size increase in males relative to females leads to larger areas on the joints, both areas where muscles attach and just weight-bearing areas of the body in our arms and legs in particular. So measurements there will help give us an estimation with greater accuracy of sex. And then once again, muscle, features that vary of the cranium. These are really exaggerated pictures, but give a little bit of an indication of some of the areas that we look at. We can even feel in ourselves our area above our eyes, where some of our muscles attach a little bit more pronounced in the bony area above your eyes in males versus females. If we feel, not pictured here, but right behind our ears, we can feel these long neck muscles attaching up to the back of our ears. Those little sort of bumps you feel where those neck muscles are attaching are going to differ significantly in some cases between males and females. Same thing with the musculature in the back of our neck. If we feel what keeps our head on straight in the back of our neck, where we get tension when we're stressed and tired and crabby, all those guys attached in the back of our skull. Greater muscle mass leads to greater muscle attachments. Yeah, right.
Now, there's some variations though amongst different regions of people. I remember being mistaking human remains of males as being females because he just wasn't familiar with Native American bone structure.
Absolutely. That's why skull is like on the lowest of our list now of sex estimating tools. Usually anthropologists wouldn't put would have very soft language about sex estimation if only a skull was available for analysis. Really, pelvis is ideal. And like I said, having cranium postcranial long bones is second best. But with skulls alone, it is very difficult because absolutely ancestral differences can contribute, because some populations are more inherently robust and some populations are holistically male and female, more gracile. That makes that assessment difficult, without question. Please feel free to ask questions mid. I have no problem with that whatsoever. So next on our list of going through our biological profile is ancestry. And there's a lot of variation in humans as a species. What we're looking at both with sex estimation traits, with ancestral estimation traits, are traits that vary in a particular direction. where research has shown that individuals more consistently demonstrate these traits if they share a similar ancestral background. Individuals more consistently share a series of traits if they have the similar biological sex. But ancestry is not usually the term that people use in day-to-day life. You wouldn't describe yourself, well, you guys might, but most people might not describe themselves as having a particular ancestry. Usually when we're filling out a form or going to the DMV or filling out census data, we're filling out what we usually see described as race. For ancestry, we're not thinking about, and it's similar to the sex and gender dichotomy, that with ancestry, we're generally thinking of evolutionary patterns of heredity, where race, similar to gender, is a cultural social construct. The races that we choose to use in the United States differ from the racial categories used in areas of Europe, that differ from the racial categories used in areas of East Asia or South Asia. My favorite explanation or demonstration of how silly, maybe I might say, racial categories are is the 1850 US Census had 3 categories that you could choose from. And obviously not everybody got to choose those categories. The 2010 census had 15 racial categories you could choose from, and you could pick up to 3 for how you described yourself. That kind of variation is not inherently going to be captured in your skeletal variation. Similarly, humans are able to get on a plane, train, or automobile today or over the last 50 plus years more consistently than they were 200, 300, 5,000 years ago. So historically, people mostly mated within their own geographic area. Today, that's a very different story. People are able to, like I said, get on a plane, train, what have you, and mate with anybody in the world. But usually, our traits don't vary or change significantly from our ancestral pattern unless there's a selective pressure against them. People have very dark skin in very northern latitudes. People can have very light skin in equatorial regions because we have a lot of cultural buffers to protect ourselves. Yes?
At the time of the Civil War, most of the soldiers in the United States Army had never been away from their hometowns.
Yeah, absolutely. And, once again, just as a product of not only economic means, but just transportation means, people didn't usually move that far or find mates so far from their home. Today, we do more regularly. So we're talking about ancestry. We're looking for features that are a demarcation of deeper ancestral patterns, but most people don't use ancestral terms. They use racial terms. So anthropologists want to try once again to educate through their reports that are given to law enforcement and others to try to bridge that divide a bit with classifiers like this, or my more elaborate one here that I'm actually hiding from myself in reading thoroughly. Nope, come back. Ancestral estimation may or may not be consistent with a self-identified, socially designated race of the individual and or may not be consistent with the perceived skin color or morphological traits noted during the life of that decedent. So it's to say that, though an individual may have a particular ancestry, it doesn't necessarily mean that that's how they describe themselves during life, as that is filled with lots of other cultural connotation that's not going to be demarcated in the skeleton. An individual may present traits that are more consistent with African ancestry, but they may have described themselves as Hispanic during life, depending upon where they came from. Similarly, someone might describe themselves as Hispanic, but might have a lot of physical traits that are more consistent with Native Americans ancestrally, because of the gene flow and ways that humans have moved about over time. So ancestry is a difficult one because a lot of times there is an inconsistency between ancestral categories and racial terms that people would regularly use to describe themselves. Yeah.
Is ancestry part normally assessed by natural renal mitochondria?
So genetically, that could be done. Skeletally, I mean, think about, well, if you have such, yourself versus your siblings. Some people just look a little bit more like dad, and some people look a little bit more like mom. And skeletally, it's going to be similar. A lot of people similarly ask about individuals that would be self or otherwise described as of mixed ancestry. They're going to display traits that look like multiple ancestries. People don't usually use exclusively like dad or exclusively like mom. There's a little bit of a mix of traits, and that's usually manifested in the skeleton as well.
But is that the type of data that the ancestry.com, those kind of groups who tell you you're mostly North European are using that genetic?
Sometimes we can have a whole talk about genetic testing. And well, I can always talk about that, but that we can put a pin in for later. But it's using a number of different genetic markers or polymorphisms, different variations in traits, but sometimes they're a little overly specific in what they're qualifying versus what genetic analysis is able to actually tell at this time, for that sort. Ray, would you a hand? Or
I just vaguely remember reading about team size.
Mhm.
Ancestry of different groups and African having larger teeth and then European and then Asian Native American having a smaller teeth. So the teeth size, you can tell what the ancestry is.
there's a whole, I don't know if I'm gonna show a picture in a second. Well, I'm gonna show a lot of pictures, but dental analysis has got a lot of different markers. Oh, I do have dental pictures in a second. There are a lot of dental variants and dental traits that are found to, once again, align with different groups. Size is not thought to be like a be all end all of ancestry, but once again, holistically with a number of different dental markers because dentition is thought to be a little bit more genetically catalyzed than other features of our body. If we, regularly lift weights, we can change the shape of our bones because they're responding to the increase in muscle mass. If we carry heavy loads over our lifetime, we can see physical markers of that wouldn't be present in someone who is more sedentary. But teeth really aren't something that you can change during your lifetime as a product, of what you do, how you behave. So it's thought that teeth are a little bit more genetically, infiltrated with who you are as an individual, where, if you were malnourished or severely ill during your childhood, that can affect what your skeleton looks like as an adult, where teeth are a little bit different. So absolutely, and I'm going to get to teeth pictures in a second. So I'm just showing some examples of features that are looked at that are non-metric, that aren't measured, but physical features. Looking at the projection of the bone at the base of your nasal opening. A lot of the variant traits are right in the middle of the facial skeleton, where with sex estimation, we talked a lot about the pelvis. With ancestry, we're looking at a lot of facial features. And other aspects of the nasal opening, sort of how sharp or raised the bone is at the margins of your nasal opening, distance between the orbits, or how widely spaced the orbits are, the breadth of the nasal opening. And we're going to look once again at a series of traits, shape of the nasal bones. And many times we can also use computer programs that have been established based on hundreds and hundreds of collections of known individuals and put in markers of metric data like this, measurements that are taken, and come to some sort of estimation of, in this case, with this program called Fordisk, sex and ancestry, as well as stature. There are also programs not viewed here that you can take that non-metric data, those visual assessments of nasal breadth and orbital width, plug those into statistical formulae as well to come up with a probability of group membership into different ancestral categories. Moving myself along to keep up with time, age estimation. We usually put the methods of age estimation from skeletal material into a subadult, not fully skeletally mature, versus adult categories. As I was just mentioning in my own foreshadowing, dental development is often the best data for estimating age in younger individuals. Teeth are usually much less affected by things that are going on within and outside an individual, like psychosocial stress, nutrition. Your teeth are still going to grow. So those are usually ideal if available. Long bone measurements can be used, as well as the developmental progress of our skeleton in terms of components of our bones when they form and when they fuse together to give us a complete skeleton. In adults, unfortunately, most of our age estimation is based on degeneration, how our body wears over time. And a lot of the wear takes place in areas of our body that have the most use. Independent of who we are and what we do, we all locomote. Predominantly, people obviously have medical conditions that can inhibit their locomotion. But for people that are able to locomote, the effects that we have on our pelvis are pretty universal. So the area where the two halves of our pelvis come together in the front make up what we call our pubic symphysis. And just the wear and tear of every time we take a step and put our weight on one side and put our weight on the other side, that just naturally pulls at the cartilage of our pelvis and causes these somewhat consistent changes in the appearance of the pubic symphysis along the lower portion of the screen. The auricular surface pictured here is where our tailbone, our sacrum, intersects with our pelvis. Once again, as our pelvis moves around with every step we take, a bit of wear and tear occurs on that surface of bone as well. Our ribs, surprisingly, take a bit of wear and tear because we're constantly breathing. It's so pesky annoying about humans. We're breathing in and out no matter what we do. We have a stronger articulation of our ribs with our vertebrae in the back, but in the front of our body, our ribs just connect to cartilage that attaches to our chest plate, our sternum. So with every breath we take, we have a bit of cartilage pulling on that front end of the rib, which over time leads to relatively consistent changes in the appearance of that bone that are pictured up there on the right. And once again, they're not dramatic changes, but there's a number of different aspects that we look at the end of those ribs to help determine how old that individual may have been during life. Once again, in a complete picture with changes to the pelvis. Not as frequently used because not as consistent, but the different separation of bones in our skull called sutures. In some individuals, but not all, which is part of the difficulty, clothes are completely fused together over the aging period. And that can give another indication of relative age of a single individual. Stature, I lovingly tease that stature is pretty boring. Just take some measurements of bones and put them into equations. Over the years, many researchers, based on known individual skeletal collections, have put together formulae that vary by population ancestry as well as sex. Individuals, like I said before, males are naturally a bit on average taller than females, and there is population variation that leads to some populations being relatively taller and or shorter than others. So some information from the skeleton, as well as a little insights, if available, in the ancestry and sex of that individual, can come up with a relatively accurate range for the relative stature of that individual. Formulae, once again, or computer programs like Fortis can gather, and you can see a number of different measurements from different areas of the body can be included. What's nice about programs like this is that they don't require all the data to be available to produce an output, because many forensic cases don't present with a complete individual. And that's both a pro and a con. You can get an output, you can get some data from not having a complete individual, but at the same time, you can only enter a few measurements and still receive an output. So there's still some discretion of the anthropologist, the practitioner, in how they interpret the data that comes from these computer programs. Last but not least, not a true part of the official biological profile, because it's usually just centered on that sex, age, ancestry, stature, but a helpful component, if available, is idiosyncratic features. When we think about the four main pillars of the biological profile, sex, age, ancestry, stature, many people could be consistent with certain categories. A 40-something white female that's 5'4". That describes me, but that could also describe a lot of other individuals that could fit those similar demographics. So idiosyncratic features, if present on the skeleton, can be really helpful in more distinctly identifying one person relative to another. And we'll look at some of those features. Oh, I didn't have dental ancestry stuff. I thought I did. I thought it was in here. Normal anatomical variations. There's a lot of features that just naturally vary as a product of our development from individual to individual, that if captured in during life medical records or antemortem data, can be used for comparison after death. Frontal sinuses, just naturally occurring open spaces. We feel those sinuses when we're sick, when it's cold season, when we have allergies. We have pressure in our cheeks here in another sinus, and we have pressure just above our eyes in the center here. And the shape, you can kind of see those little almost McDonald M's on this particular individual, especially on the left, the shape of those sinuses are very unique. They've been determined via judicial statute to be as individualizing as a fingerprint. So if you have ante-mortem records that have captured the shape and appearance of your frontal sinuses, usually those panoramic x-rays that the dentist does sometimes will capture them, or if you've had any scanning of your head, can be a useful identifier for comparison after death. The lower image is a bit more of an extreme example, but a very common example of what are called mandibular tori, or just bony projections. I actually have one on the roof of my mouth. I have a palatine torus up there at the top that, if documented during life, can be useful for comparison after death. These can be in the category of anomalies as well, maybe an extra hole or foramen in a bone that is not normally there in human anatomy. Not problematic, but something that might have been documented that can be useful for comparison, maybe not having as many teeth as somebody else. I naturally never developed wisdom teeth or third molars. I think that makes me evolutionarily and genetically advanced, but it means I didn't have to deal with any sort of impaction or other issues that people have with those third molars. So that's an anomaly. Pathological conditions, certain diseases, osteomyelitis, periostitis, very common inflammations of the skeleton can leave markers on bone. If anybody has ever broken a bone, even if it was perfectly set in a clinical or medical setting, still leaves a bony scar that can be appreciated after death. And I mentioned before very briefly, but markers of occupational stress. If you had a very significant stressor in your occupation or hobby during life, a very frequently cited example are tennis players. People that play tennis professionally or consistently over their lifetime have a dominant arm that's both thicker and longer than their non-playing arm. That's a marker of an occupational stressor that they use. Many Central American and Mesoamerican archaeological populations show evidence of squatting for significant periods of time, which many women predominantly did in historic populations and today as well, that show variations in the ankle that are consistent with having a squatting position for an extended period of time. Also, just having a lot of interest in paleopathology. Currently, I couldn't talk about pathological conditions without showing some pictures of syphilis, because all anthropologists and archaeologists love syphilis, right? Not true? Right? There's some head shaking. People don't really experience this degree of skeletal manifestation of disease today. Predominantly, it's more so broken bones, dental work that may have been done that can be compared with records of an individual during life, but had to show some good syphilitic skulls and tibia. Last but not least, trauma analysis. And as I mentioned, not everyone that dies experienced trauma, and not everyone that's experienced trauma is going to have an evidence of that trauma on their skeleton. But usually what medical examiners and coroners are asking of an anthropologist is to assess timing, whether a traumatic event occurred before death that showed evidence of healing, at or around the time of death, or was something that happened in the post-mortem environment. What mechanism produced that damage or trauma, whether it was blunt or sharp force trauma, ballistic or thermal. And then overall documentation, sequence and number of incidents of trauma, and whatever it says below the screen. Placement and location, a little peekaboo there to remind myself. Placement and location for documentation purposes of trauma that may have occurred in an individual, to compare to witness statements, to compare to assailant statements. This type of documentation can be important and may not always be appreciated through the skin, both because the skin may be decomposed or the trauma was to an extent that it had a greater impact on the skeleton. Nope, now it's figuring again. There we go. Trauma is usually assessed through assessment of fracture lines. These are sort of any kind of discontinuity in the bone and around the point of impact, usually, especially in cases of blunt force trauma. Given our good recollection of physics, we know that energy isn't gained or lost, but it's changed in form. So when an individual is hit with some sort of object, that energy is transferred into the material that is been hit. and causes a dissipation of force through the production of fracture lines. We usually see these fracture lines occurring in the form of fractures that radiate immediately from the point of impact, as well as concentric or more rounded fractures that occur secondarily to those radiating fractures. And bone fractures in a very similar pattern to other mediums. Glass is a frequently used example in forensic contexts of how fracturing can occur, as well as how sequencing of fracturing can occur, based on the demonstration here with a trophy case that had two fracturing events, where some fracture lines you can sort of see in the center stop because a pre-existing fracture occurred, indicating that the top incident in the glass occurred before the lower image. Blunt force trauma in the skull can be appreciated in a similar fashion by looking at fracture lines and trying to reduce them back to a point of impact, if possible. Sharp force trauma is defined by trauma that occurs with a tool that is relatively thin, with a sharp edge or blade. This is an image across the top. I think it's a historic image. I did not bring a series of pictures of my medieval sword wounds. They're fantastic. But it usually has sharp margins and doesn't have any evidence of healing in that location. Right there. Weirdly, I like to say, but another type of sharp force trauma that is frequently in disturbing numbers found in the Chicago area is dismemberment trauma. That usually involves the use of a knife or a saw. And saws leave an extreme amount of evidentiary material behind in terms of what it can tell investigators about the type of tool that was used, whether it was a saw versus a knife. Once again, documentation of sequence of where areas of dismemberment occurred, the direction of force, as well as the type of tool that was used, whether it was a hand saw or mechanical saw. And we can kind of already just see, we're looking at the cut surface here, the different appearance of evidence left based on the tool itself and what tool was used. Projectile trauma, thinking about ballistic or gunshot trauma, a lot of evidence can be deduced from looking at the entrance versus exit wound. Entrance wound displayed on the left is relatively small, relatively consistent. Once again, with our appreciation of physics, once in this case, a bullet passes through a material, it's inherently slowed down. And as that projectile, slows, it actually increases its range of damage. So while the entrance wound is relatively round and similar to the size of the projectile, not exactly, but similar to the size of the projectile, the exit wound is relatively larger and more irregular because of the slower velocity that's induced by the bullet passing through a material, as well as a change in the appearance. We have what we would describe as internal beveling and external beveling on this exit wound. So we can have appreciation both of the direction that the projectile traveled, as well as the orientation of the projectile passing through the bone or material. So, intersection of forensics and archaeology. Like I said, I feel like it is relatively obvious. My Captain Obvious intersection there. Thank you for the pity laughs. I find myself hysterical. But the remains wouldn't be discovered in the first place without archaeological insight and technique. Archaeology, we know, is inherently destructive. We're inherently changing the environment that material was in. But it's the way in which the material is recovered and the extent of recovery that dictates how well a forensic anthropological analysis can proceed. With a knowledge of the environment that the remains were found in, how the excavation occurred, really is the bread and butter of what allows a forensic anthropologist to subsequently do their analysis. Like I said, for Cook County, which is my primary consultation employer, we don't really do a lot of primary excavations because usually the remains are recovered, and then it's determined by the medical examiners that they would like a forensic anthropological consultant because they don't have another means of identification, usually is the main reason, or they would like, tool mark analysis in the case of a dismemberment or some sort of broader trauma analysis. But in coroner counties, outside of Cook County, they usually, appropriately, smartly, may ask for more help if remains were interred. And I said there was gonna be a little story time. My best example, I think, of assistance in a recovery, and it was like my only to knowledge, Chicago Tribune claim of documentation of a recovery was in 2018. There was a woman in and around, it was in Lake County, it was in around the Fox Lake area, was digging in her backyard. She wanted to make a new sort of terraced garden, was I think the long-term plan. And let me tell you, she put a lot more back dirt that had bones in it into her wheelbarrow before she decided something was weird. Finding more bones than you would expect someone. She thought they were non-human animal bones, I should specify. But still, she kept digging. And I think it's once she hit a mandible that she was like, this seems weird. Maybe I should call somebody about this. She did. She called the Lake County coroner. They switched coroners to present, but at the time, Lake County coroner was a forensic odontologist, a forensic dentist. And he was like, yes, that mandible is human. And yes, you should stop digging there. So he went to the scene. He called myself, as well as I mentioned, NCIS from the naval station up north. And we came and did a recovery, and it was a number of fragmented human remains. And in working with the Illinois archaeological folk, they determined, I don't know exactly how they determined it, but the remains appeared from biological profile Native American in ancestry, and they determined the remains were about 800 to 1,000 years old. So those remains were not forensic in a context of requiring an investigation to determine what happened to that individual, but they were still thoroughly recovered and sent to the Illinois archaeological group to determine. I think they were still working on, I had consulted with them about potential repatriation to Native American groups that were living in that area. They didn't have a lot of data to go on because it was just a single individual found in this woman's backyard, but they were not recent in origin. And so, like I said, archaeology inherently is a part of what forensic anthropologists do, because it's that appreciation for appropriate recovery techniques, documenting when things don't go correctly in the excavation, as well as appreciating what may have not been recovered and means by which to figure out if it'll be possible to extend the extent of recovery. So, questions. This is a picture that a student drew of me in a skeleton. I think it's funny. I like to include it in top. But yes.
I went to a lecture at Northwestern some years ago, and a gentleman was there from Columbia, and they have portable DNA analysis machines that they can take out into the field, take a soil sample, and get all kinds of DNA identified, even if they've never seen viruses or whatever they're studying before. Is there such a tool for you to take to a site?
So it depends on what one's objective is. But in terms of the objective of identification, well, a few things. Backtrack. DNA analyses require equipment, like you just mentioned, and they're pretty costly for human-specific material. So one has to be in a locale that has access to a lab that will run the analysis. But also you need something to compare it to, which is usually the linchpin. For most unidentified individuals that are discovered, if you don't have anything to compare it to, if there's no DNA sample on file somewhere, or a family that's providing a potential match, then sure, you have a DNA analysis, but it doesn't give you identity for who somebody might be. So in many cases, especially given the large homeless population in the Chicago area, there's usually not a lot to go on because people don't often have their DNA on file somewhere for comparison. And a family is not actively looking for them. DNA analysis isn't necessarily useful in identification. And once again, because of the cost and access for analysis, DNA is not usually run on all unidentified individuals. A good question. Oh, yes.
This is kind of an off the wall.
I'll take it.
question was coming. I watched the TV quiz show Jeopardy,
Mhm.
and they had a second chance tournament recently, which was just won by someone from Chicago, as it so happens, calling the person himself Rowan, and when they introduce themselves, the reading starts, they tell a little something about them. So the Rowan said, "I've decided I'm non-binary."
Mhm.
I just reminded me, and I emailed a friend of mine, we used to be in community reports to this person when she was calling herself Nicole. And her appearance then was fairly similar to now, maybe a little bit later, but we all do that, my hair color was different, and we don't do that all the time. But basically the same external fleshy shape and whatnot. When Rowan kicks off this mortal coil, whenever that happens, whether he or she is rich or whatever, is it going to be possible? I mean, is the pelvis gonna look female, or are there felt on these markers that you use? Can they be not very determinative on certain individuals because they really are not really very gender differentiated?
That's such a great question, and yes and no.
I mean, even if you find enough bump,
Mhm.
like the whole pelvis and some of these other things that can really tell you, yes, it's a male, yes, it's female, and you still can't tell. Could there be somebody like that?
There is clinical distinction of someone that is I mean, there's a few options. There's a clinical distinction of someone that's intersex, meaning that their chromosomes are such that they do not display distinct, and they're talking soft tissue, biological male or biological female genitalia. But there's also a number of chromosomal scenarios where people have 3 sex chromosomes, either XXX, XYY, XXY, that can lead to, usually they're most clinically discussed as associated with infertility. None of that is skeletal. That's all soft tissue complications. But absolutely, a good forensic anthropologist, if many of the features that are distinctive of sex in the pelvis throughout the body come up as more indeterminate or seem to be more mixed, the anthropologist should speak to that. I thought you were going to maybe go a different direction and speak to a transgender type scenario, in which someone has a biological sex but does not feel that their body conforms to what their biological sex is, or who they are does not conform to their biological sex. In that sense, their skeleton would probably still align with their biological sex, even if, and there's not enough data to speak to this definitively yet, but most people that are transgender and engage in, let's say, hormone replacement as a step 1, usually do so after puberty, which means their skeleton has fully matured following the hormonal profile they have following their biological sex.
Pelvis that God gave them.
Yes.
Stuck with it or whatever.
And there's not enough evidence to today, at this moment, say that hormone replacement after, skeletal maturity is going to change that shape. But there's a really cool, well-documented array of gender affirming surgeries. Usually they're predominantly cranial. No one, wants to change the shape of or desires to change the shape of their pelvis to conform to their gender identity, but they want to change facial features. And that would still leave evidence on the skeleton of a surgical intervention that could be documented and could be put in part and parcel of a greater picture of who that individual is. But in the example that you're citing, I would assume that their skeleton would appear consistent with their I don't know about their genes, but their biological sex assumption.
I want to bring up another example. I'm not going to remember the exact DNA. Years ago, I was a volunteer on the inpatient psych unit at Children's Memorial Hospital. And we had a teenage girl who was there for suicidal ideation and so forth. And she belonged to a culture that really, girls are supposed to be women and supposed to get married and make babies, and if you don't do that, boy, you're nothing. And that's why she was so depressed. She was like 14, 15, 16 and was not yet having periods and not developing female curves and all that stuff. And she got really bummed out about it. And what they found out, and I'm not going to remember, females have 1 X and 1 Y, right?
Nope, 2 X's.
Two X's. Okay. though she identified as female and was raised as female, she didn't have two X's.
Hmm.
Maybe she had.
I was saying, it might be one of those 3 chromosomal
Something like
situations.
And that, it was very upsetting to her.
Sure.
Especially to
So, I mean, in an ideal world, I mean, humans are just not that binary. There are a lot of variations in between. So what we're looking for, and like I said, that's why you would never want to estimate sex based on a single trait. You want to look at a complete picture of an individual as much as is possible. But there are absolutely scenarios where people don't seem to really fall into that, more grouping into biologically female or grouping into biologically male scenario. And the anthropologist should explain that in the report, because that could be an indication to broaden who they're looking for in terms of identifying this, missing or an unidentified person, for sure.
And I'm sorry, I'm trying to look at- I wonder now about gay people, especially gay men. Well, maybe we'll find out someday that their genetic heritage is a little different from men who identify as straight.
But still probably wouldn't influence their skeleton, right, in any way based on that chromosomal, the biological sex chromosomes.
I got to know a gay man in a community theater play that I did many years ago, and I got to know him well enough to ask him this question. I said, "Were you ever attracted to girls?" And he said, "No. As soon as I started
Mhm.
having sexual feelings, I was always drawn to males." Which sounded to me like he was born that way. It
Mhm.
was genetic, in other words.
Yeah.
So I'm just throwing all that out there. Someday scientists may solve all this
Absolutely.
someday.
Yeah, in the programs you show or in the analyses you do, they say it's a man or a woman or this or that. You get a probability along with that?
Yeah, absolutely. All the measurable analyses, and like I said, there are still statistical analyses that are done on the visual traits. They provide probability. Because that's important if a case is going to court. No scientific method is 100% without error. So probabilities can provide sort of that scenario of you have a probability of an individual being female as maybe 55%. Well, that's not very strong. And that's going to give an indication that there might be something unusual there. Or if an individual's ancestry, is, I don't know, making up numbers, 90% likely of European ancestry, that's pretty strong. And you can have greater confidence in those results versus a lower probability. So absolutely, the data is important. And also the demonstration of how the data is interpreted is important as well. Yeah, right.
In terms of chromosomes, is there only 4 possibilities per sex or is there more?
Well, I mean, there's primarily for a species too, but there are variants that are non.
The 2 other variants of these, what's that?
Well, yeah, you can have triple X, you can have XXY, you can have XY. I mean, you can have any multiple combination, usually in a trisomy. I have not heard of, could be incorrect, of 4 sex chromosomes. 2 is the normal state for all animals on the planet for chromosomes in terms of sex. 3 is usually I don't know numbers on it, but an unusual variant, I'd say. Yeah.
This is a follow-up, when you find skeletal remains, complete, what's the rough percentages of accuracy and anything going down your list, age, sex?
Off the top of my head, age I do not know. Sex and ancestry is usually 90% for most cited literature and accuracy of the methods. It's not too bad.
Dr. Waxenbaum, can I ask something from Zoom?
You may ask something from Zoom.
I just first off want to congratulate you on an outstanding presentation. I think that at times this material can be quite difficult. And, it takes years of practice and theory. So I really congratulate you on being able to, teach us these methods and how they're used. So thank you very much. My question revolves around outreach to forensic anthropology. I'm a teacher as well, professor, and I'm always finding new ways to outreach archaeology. What would be some of your suggestions to more successfully outreach forensic anthropology? Do you have any theory and practice worksheets or hands-on experiences that you use?
So that's a great question. Thank you. Most of my outreach, I have to say, is,
Repeat the question.
oh, I'm sorry. He was asking about outreach of sort of, I'm gonna reinterpret your question, tell me if I'm doing a bad job. Of outreach and engagement with the broader community to better explain what forensic anthropology is, what forensic anthropologists do. I would say, and this is probably embarrassing, but most of my outreach is usually with medical legal community, with prosecutors, with attorneys, with medical examiners and coroners about what anthropologists really can do, because not a lot of jurisdictions are familiar with anthropology. And also law enforcement on the opposite side. I just gave a talk last week to a group of funeral directors to explain what anthropologists do. So it's usually somewhat within the relative medical legal community to provide a better understanding of what anthropological services can offer them. It's sort of, a little bit of self-sale to be like, hey, look, if you have an unidentified body, anthropologists can provide you some information
Right on.
that can be useful.
Cool, thank you. And so it's mostly lecture based and what you've done for us today. Do you have any hands-on activities that you use?
Not usually in this kind of context. In all honesty, I was thinking of bringing some show and tell, but wasn't able to grab them from my office as quickly as I had thought. But really, it would be similar, part and parcel to the visual images.
Perfect.
For me personally, most of my hands-on stuff does sometimes come with these types of lectures, but is usually in a Northwestern undergraduate or graduate environment.
Okay, thank you for your time. Well done.
Absolutely, thank you. Other, yeah.
I have a quick one. Assuming that some of maybe younger students specifically might be on chat, can you talk just very briefly about like how you got to the point of being a forensic anthropologist? Like, was this what you did in grad school, or did you take a different route?
Oh, sure. I'll make this my life story quick. I love to tell students that I was a very type A proud pre-med undergraduate student, because I think when you're good at science, you sort of presume that you should be a medical doctor. I don't know why. High school students, don't have the range of experience or familiarity with the options that are out there in the world. But very quickly in undergraduate times, I appreciated that I was not as engaged in pre-med classes as some of my peers were. And I happened to just stumble across a human osteology elective class, as well as an introduction to cultural anthropology class. And I fell in love with both of them and appreciated that I could like anatomy and science and not be a medical doctor, which had never occurred to me before. So I jumped ship on pre-med and a bio-neuroscience double major and went full-fledged anthropology. And from there, so I graduated with an undergrad degree in anthropology, a master's in archaeology, and a PhD in biological anthropology. And then subsequently received board certification in forensic anthropology, which is similar to board certification that your cardiologist or podiatrist might go through. Quick story.
All right. Thank you, everyone, for coming out today. And a reminder that our next meeting, no meeting in November, but December is going to be our holiday meeting. And we'll be starting a little bit early. So please come in person if you can. 2 o'clock, we're going to have potluck. If you're interested, people here, if you want to mark that on the sheet up here at the sign up sheet. If you're virtual, if you could email info@chicagoarchaeology.org. That's info@chicagoarchaeology.org to let us know if you're interested in coming. So that will be 2 o'clock, December 4th. That's a Sunday. We'll have dinner first, early dinner, and then we'll have a talk from Dr. Jennifer Raff. Now, this is going to be a very interesting talk. This is cutting edge stuff, determining migration patterns through DNA. So, such as, how did Native Americans get here? Well, let's look at the DNA and see what it says. So this is very new stuff. She just wrote a book. If you want to check it out, Jennifer Raff, and that will be December, 2 o'clock here for eating and socialization, and 3:30 for the lecture. So I hope everybody comes back for that. And we have a sign-up sheet right up here. If we don't already have your info, we'd like to have your info. And if you're interested in coming to the party, please note it on the sheet there. Does anybody else have any other announcements? Yeah, Lucy.
Pizzas.
Yeah, it's a potluck. It's potluck and pizza. Yes, so it's gonna be, we're gonna have pizza, and then if you're interested in bringing a dish, let us know, so we know what dish. And we can then figure out what Lucy? Okay,
Ray,
yes,
I might suggest that you say that our annual meeting is going to be in January and that we're looking for board nominations.
okay,
And
yes.
particularly individuals who might have web publishing and graphic skills to help us with our publicity and outreach.
So what Ann just said is we're gonna have our annual like meeting for determining board membership nominations, that kind of thing. January, and we're looking for people especially that have web and graphic design background. That would be a big help. If you're interested in participating, being on the board, being on committees, January is the time that's we'd like to see if you're interested and get you on board. All right. Oh, in January? January would be
29.
29th. Yeah. But any other announcements? Well, thank you for coming out today. This has been very informative. I felt like I was watching like NCIS or something. It was very cool. All right, thank you, everyone. All right, I'm gonna end the Zoom meeting now.